Good evening, everyone. This is Mary Rapar, and welcome to the Stevenson Grange number 121's last program of our Community Resiliency series with Dr. David Montgomery from University of Washington. And he will give the talk on growing a revolution and bringing soil back to life. But again, I want to welcome you all. Please go to our Stevenson Grange Facebook pages for more information on our other programs. And we're always looking for members so we can have more programs in co-sponsorship with our Stevenson Community Library, which I want to thank very much for hosting these programs this year. And with COVID, it's been really interesting, but we're still doing it. And next year we will have other programs. So without further ado, Dr. Montgomery, please take over.
Well, okay. Thank you, Mary, for the invitation to talk to you all. And I'm going to try and share my screen here. And that should be showing you 3 book covers. I mean, I'm delighted to support programs through libraries and through the Grange, and glad to see that you're all interested in this topic of soil and soil health. I'm a geologist by background and training, so I never imagined when I was in college or grad school that I'd be writing books about the importance of soil and human civilizations and how to take care of the soil, restore the soil. But it turns out over the last 10 years, I've worked with my wife on a series of 3 books that we lovingly call our Dirt Trilogy, that started with the cover on the left that you see there, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, which is the story of how the way that people treated land affected society after society throughout the course of their post-glacial agricultural history. And then that book can be summarized in sort of the single sentence of the societies that didn't take care of their land, the land didn't take care of the people over the long run. Not a huge mystery there, but I did write a whole book about it. The Hidden Half of Nature is the one that Anne, my wife, a biologist, and I wrote together, and it is looking at how microbial life, bacteria and fungi in the soil for the most part, influence soil fertility and how they are the sort of forgotten, critically important part of agriculture that we overlooked in the 20th century. And Growing a Revolution is the most recent of these 3 books. It takes the lessons of history from the first book, the science from the second book, and looks at how regenerative farmers around the world really have brought life back to their land and profitability back to their farms by restoring their soil. And if anyone wants to contact us, you can contact us through our website down there at the bottom, or our Twitter account. We're not all that active on Twitter, but we do put out things when we find interesting things we'd like to share with people. So let me start with this map of the world that shows the global extent of soil degradation as of 10, 15 years ago, as mapped by the United Nations. It's a very broad brush approach to looking at the state of the world's soils, but I like to start with it because there's an awful lot of orange and red on the map. There's a lot of degraded and very degraded soil in the world. And we could quibble about the definitions of which is which and to what extent, but the point being that soil degradation is truly a global problem, and it's a problem that has a reach that is projected to become actually worse in the next 100 years unless we change things in agriculture, as I'll be getting into. At present, according to the most recent UN Global State of the Soil Assessment from back in 2015, humanity, the global us, are losing about 1/3% of our global food production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil erosion and soil degradation. And 0.3% doesn't sound like a very big annual number. I mean, it's kind of what we're all getting on our savings accounts these days. It's a very small percentage. But it adds up if you let it run over time. And when we think about what that 0.3% loss per year would mean over the next 100 years, the balance of this century, it would add up to a loss of about another 1/3 of our global food production capacity. And so far, the best estimates I can find are that we've degraded about 1/3 of the world's potential farmland to the extent that it's no longer growing food productively. And this trend of declining soil productivity and global agricultural production as a result of it is obviously at odds with the rising human population and the projections for the balance of the 21st century. And it's my contention that we need to basically change the way that we've been doing things in farming practices to avoid the fate that I documented of previous civilizations in the Dirt book. So what was the basic takeaway message from that first book that got me into it? It was a look back at archaeology and the state of the world's soils. I thought it would be a wonderful excuse to be able to travel the world and look at ruins in different countries and think about the connections between archaeology and geomorphology, my branch of geology, the study of what shapes topography, what controls this form of Earth's surface and the state of the land. And what I found in researching dirt was, a slightly different story. Soil erosion, it turns out, played a role in the demise of many ancient civilizations, from Neolithic or Bronze Age Europe to classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, Central America, and other societies that I cataloged in dirt. And that's not a terribly novel finding. People have been writing about that actually since the time of the classical Greek philosopher Plato. And when he observed the state of the Greek landscape and ascribed degradation of farm fields in certain watersheds in ancient Greece to farming practices that dated back to the Bronze Age. But what I found that was a common element in stories of societies around the world was that there was a fairly unconventional villain to the tale of land degradation historically, and that was the plow, which I found surprising because it's iconic. It's an iconic agricultural implement that is, we think about in terms of what do farmers do? Well, they plow. Its tillage is a long-running tradition in terms of a way to prepare the land, the seed bed for planting, to prepare to its great weed control. And what does a plow do, though? It fundamentally changes the balance of soil erosion and soil production at the surface of the earth in the areas that we rely on to feed ourselves. What does a plow do in turning and inverting the soil? It basically can wipe out the field of weeds, but it also leaves the land bare and vulnerable to erosion by water or wind in the days or months or years following that kind of disturbance. And the image that's on the screen now is the oldest image that we have of a plow, back from a small cylinder sealed in baked clay from ancient Sumerian days, from about 4000 BC in 4000 before present, a couple thousand years BC in the Middle East. But how many places around the world have you ever been where you see a natural landscape with a lot of bare earth? Nature tends to clothe herself in plants, and for simple reasons. The building of organic matter helps to build fertility, and that organic matter can help protect the surface from the kind of erosion that you see in the slide that's on the screen now. This is a slide from over in Eastern Washington in the Palouse region from back in 1970, and it captures pretty well why a geologist like myself would look at tillage of plowing as a slow motion natural disaster. This is a winter wheat field. You'll notice it's after it's been plowed and before any kind of crop leafed out. And all those little channels that have been carved into the surface are things that I would call a rill, something you could erase with a single pass of a plow. But that if they happen year after year, all that erosion and that shunting of material off of a sloping field can really add up to an awful lot of erosional degradation of the landscape. And that's what this slide shows. The fence up here in the upper right-hand corner is the fence at the corner of a field in the Palouse. Again, then this photo was taken back in 1961. This is not a brand new problem. It's a problem that's been going on for a while. And you can see these kind of cliffs at the edge of regularly plowed fields all over the Palouse, all over Iowa. There's a study that just came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that document that roughly half the topsoil in Iowa has been eroded off over the last 100 years. And this example from the Palouse shows you how extreme that can be. This fence was installed, the original fence was installed back in 1911 when the land surface was up here at the edge of the field. And the only things that have happened in this field for the 50 years between the time that fence was put in and the photograph was taken is that the land was regularly tilled in a wheat fallow rotation, and that those kind of rills that developed on the land year after year gradually added up to erode away this cliff. Well, those rills plus actually the slow downslope motion of tilling in the same direction year after year, pushing soil downhill slowly, resulted in this cliff. Well, how much of a cliff is that? This little gray bar right here from down there to up there is actually a washed out 1 foot increment on a survey rod, on a stadia rod at that's in the original negative. This is a 5-foot cliff that developed over 50 years. That's about a foot of erosion every decade. That translates to about an inch a year. And there's nowhere on Earth that soil forms that fast, at least not out of fresh rocks. I'll show you some examples of farmers who've been building fertile soil at a pace that could keep up with that, but they're doing it they already have the mineral matter, they're adding the organic matter to their soils. And that is actually critical for soil fertility and long-term productivity. And in the continental United States, we've degraded the soil organic matter content of many of our agricultural soils by about 50% from the level that they were at the time when those soils were first converted from farms or prairies, forests or prairies to farmland. Soil organic matter itself is about 50% carbon. So we've lowered the carbon holding content of our agricultural soils by about half in the United States since the dawn of colonial agriculture, the last couple hundred years. And that's a problem that has been ongoing and is significant. And what does it look like in the field? It looks a lot like this comparison. The soil on the right is a soil that is, both of these soils are from neighboring farm fields in North Carolina. The one on the right is a conventionally worked field. It's been worked conventionally for the last 100 years with intensive tillage and synthetic fertilizers. You'll notice that it looks a lot like California beach sand. And there's a reason for that. It is beach sand, but it's 10 million year old beach sand. It's the geological deposit, the parent material that soil developed on was beach sand, Atlantic beach sand over in North Carolina. But it's basically a beach sand with a bunch of crusty salts in it. It's not terribly fertile. There's not very much that was actually living in that soil. But if you go right across the fence row into a bit of forest that was a farm 150 years ago that was abandoned and went back to forest, you find a very different looking soil developed from the same materials, the same parent material, the same underlying geology. And it has the consistency of more like chocolate cake. It's a dark, rich brown color with lots of organic matter. And when you dig a shovel into it, life goes scurrying off. It's like night and day in terms of fertility. I've yet to meet a farmer who would prefer to farm in this stuff than to farm with this stuff. And this illustrates that the degradation of soil is not just the loss of soil from the erosional examples I was showing you a minute ago, but it also results from the conversion of rich organic matter rich soil into organic matter poor soil. And that's that 50% loss of organic matter that's happened in farms around the United States. So we have these two dimensions to soil degradation, the loss of the soil itself and the degradation of soil organic matter. How fast does it happen? Well, the slide I just showed you shows how fast it can be reversed. It can take a century and a half to bring the organic matter back with leaving nature to her own devices. But what about eroding soil from farms? One of the things I did in researching dirt was to actually look at and investigate how fast is soil eroding from farms today. If you go back and study ancient Greece or Rome, we don't have data from those eras in terms of what the pace of soil loss was. We kind of have to triangulate it from archaeology and studying the soils. But there's a lot of people who've been measuring rates of soil loss over the last 100 years or so in scientific studies. And I went and compiled all the data I could find on how fast are the world's farms eroding and how fast does nature build soils. And what I found is summarized in this slide. How fast is soil eroding from farms today? The average value I came up globally was about 1.5 millimeters a year. That's not really fast. I mean, your fingernails grow, at least my fingernails grow faster than that. But what it means is that it takes less than 20 years to lose an inch of topsoil. And the thickness of native topsoils in landscapes around the world ranges from about 6 to 12 inches on average, which means that you could basically lose the whole topsoil in a century or a couple centuries of farming. And this has happened in regions around the world, as I talked about in dirt. How fast does nature build soils? Well, herein lies the problem. Nature only rebuilds soils at a pace of a couple percent of a millimeter a year. And at that pace, it can take 500 to 1,000 years to make back that inch of soil that modern farming practices can lose in a couple decades. Therein lies the rub. We've been eroding and degrading the world's soils that we depend on for our food supply at a pace that's faster than nature, left to her own devices, can rebuild them. And therein lies the basic argument that I make for why we need to change farming practices over the next 100 years to sustain farming well into the future. But what I've given you so far is the data you could take to calculate for yourselves in the back of a napkin how long an agricultural civilization might be expected to stick around. And it turns out that that net soil loss of about 1 millimeter a year, which is a conservative value from the numbers that I just showed you, implies that the erosion of a typical 0.5 meter to 1 meter, or roughly 1.5 to 3 foot thick hill slope soil would only take, centuries, 500 to 1,000 years on average. And that's approximately, it turns out, the lifespan of most major civilizations, with some key exceptions that I hope you're sitting there going, but Dave, what about like the Nile? That's been farmed for thousands of years, or the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus and the Brahmaputra in India, or the big rivers of lowland China. All places where farming practices have been maintained for thousands of years. But think about the geography of all the places I just listed off. They're big river floodplains. And what happens on big river floodplains? Well, it's hidden right there in the name. They flood. What comes along with the flood? Sand, silt, mud. Nature can replenish soil lost from fields on floodplains if they're regularly inundated with flooding. And when you look at the regions that have sustained agriculture for millennia in our post-glacial history, they're all areas where the landscape is naturally quite resilient to the plow. The problems start when we actually start using tillage-based farming outside of floodplains and up on hill slopes, and that literally starts the clock ticking for how long those environments can be farmed, and therefore how long they can actually support robust human populations. So this brings up the question of, is soil restoration possible? And I'm happy to report that I'm done with the depressing part of the talk. And we're going to start talking more about the optimistic part, how we could actually reverse the historical pattern of soil loss and soil degradation that has plagued societies around the world. And I really started learning about this and discovering that there was actually options for reversing this in relatively short order in a place that you might not expect a geologist to do a whole lot of field work. And that was in my wife's garden. I had the great fortune to marry a biologist, Anne Beclay, who's also a great writer, and we wrote The Hidden Half of Nature together, describing her experiences. And she's the brains behind what happened in our yard, because I'm not a gardener. I have a brown thumb. She has a green thumb. I think she's a plant whisperer. But she basically restored the soil in our yard in North Seattle, where we bought a house when I got tenure at UW. We bought a house that had a yard that was all lawn, and Anne's biologist wanted a garden. She lusted after a garden ever since we were in graduate school, and she was growing things in pots in the front yard and so forth. And here we finally had a yard. We pulled the lawn off to try and plant, and we realized that we had really crappy soil. We had glacial till. You'll notice the color of our yard was about the color of that degraded North Carolina tobacco plant field. There wasn't a single worm beneath that lawn when we pulled it off. Hardly any organic matter. We had about 1% organic matter, not much carbon in the yard, not much for life to actually feed on. And Anne decided that we had the mineral half of what makes fertile soil. What makes fertile soil is the combination of biology and geology. It's sort of the marriage of the two, if you'll pardon the pun. And she realized that we had the mineral part, but we didn't have the organic matter. And so she started adding wood chips and coffee grounds from the coffee shop down the street, zoo doo, the composted herbivore manure from the Seattle Zoo, all kinds of sources of organic matter. She started adding composting and mulching, layering it on her soil. And over the course of about 10 years, she managed to convert the soil we started with, the soil on the left, into the soil that we now have, the soil on the right. And you'll notice there's a color difference that's even more pronounced than from the North Carolina farm comparison that I showed you. We now have roughly 10% of organic matter rather than 1%. And the plants in her garden are thriving. It's a wonderful place. And we realized, though, that the change that happened in our yard and that happened in our soil, both below ground and above ground, was due not just to the compost that we were adding, but to what happened with that compost and what the trillions of organisms in the yard, all the bacteria and fungi that were living in our yard, that exploded in their population as a result of all that decomposing organic matter that was feeding them. They were basically cycling nutrients from that compost back into the soil food web. The things that ate them, the microarthropods and the protozoa and nematodes that were eating the bacteria and fungi, were taking the elements that those microorganisms harvested out of the compost and they were turning it into micro manure, essentially fertilizing our soil from the inside out. And as we started to look into what the processes that trigger the dramatic restoration and change in our soil in 10 years, a remarkably short period of time relative to how nature can build soils, we were led into the literature on what's happening in a zone called the rhizosphere, which is literally Greek for the zone around the roots of a plant. And we've all been taught how plants will take carbon dioxide, merge it with water through the alchemical, the bioalchemical magic of photosynthesis to build their green bodies and to build the carbohydrate structures of their green bodies and produce oxygen in the process, for which we all should be grateful. But when Ann and I took soil science classes, we really only learned about half of the role that roots play in plant health and nutrition. We learned about roots as straws that would pull materials up from the ground in groundwater. But what was neglected was that roots are actually a two-way street. Exudates, things that are shown here in these red arrows, are actually produced by plants that exude compounds that they make through photosynthesis. They exude them out into the soil. And what are they exuding? They're exuding carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. What does that sound like to you? It sounds a lot like food, doesn't it? That's a meal. Why are plants putting meals out into the soil? Well, they're doing it because the root zone, the rhizosphere, is actually a biological bazaar where the plants are trading photosynthate, the products of photosynthesis, with the microbial world, feeding microbes in essence, in exchange for what those microbes make out of those photosynthates. So when plant exit plant roots, they basically get metabolized within about a millimeter to a centimeter, the thickness to the length of my thumbnail. They disappear into the bodies of microorganisms and they get metabolized, because what does any living organism do with what they eat? They metabolize it and turn it into their own waste products. Well, what are those waste products that microbes are producing in the rhizosphere? Things like plant growth promoting hormones, it turns out. When we read scientific papers that documented how plants were putting compounds out into the soil and bacteria were turning that into growth hormones that the plants took back up to promote their growth, we realized that this is a positive reinforcement, a virtuous circle, where the plants are feeding the microbes and the microbes are doing things so that the plants can grow larger and healthier and produce more exudates to feed more microbes. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. And fungi in the soil also do similar things where their fungal hyphae will connect up to the roots of plants and then extend off into the soil. And what do fungi do? Well, maybe we should think first about what they can't do. They can't photosynthesize. They're saprophytes. They eat decaying organic matter or compounds that plants exude from their roots. And so what the fungi will do is they will actually prospect for things like phosphorus or zinc in the soil, elements that plants need for their growth and health. And they will actually transport them back to the plant and give them to the plant. And what do the plants do? They basically feed the fungi with exudates, with carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And so these types of relationships between what Ann and I came to call the hidden half of nature are happening below ground, out of sight, out of mind in the microscopic world that we can't detect with our own senses. But those relationships are actually as every bit as evolutionarily honed as the relationships we see above ground between insect pollinators and flowers, for example. These have become to light much more recently, because only recently have the analytical tools to explore these connections really come online, because we can't see this world with our own senses. But it turns out that sometimes when insect herbivores will nibble on a plant, that plant will send out exudates into the soil to recruit particular microbes that then produce particular metabolites that the plant can take up and either use to produce its own compounds that repel that particular specific insect pest. These are very highly adapted, very specific relationships that relate to plant defense and plant health that are mediated through the life in the soil, which in turn is influenced by the amount of organic matter in the soil, because that organic matter is the fuel, the food, the fuel for microbial ecology. And so after realizing that there are ways to restore the soil very rapidly if we rebuild soil organic matter through our own practices on the land in our own yard. I started wondering, it's one thing to restore the soil in a small urban lot in North Seattle, but could you do this on full-scale, operational, commercially viable, economically profitable farms at scale? And so I took roughly 6 months away from UW to work on Growing a Revolution, where I visited farmers around the world who had turned soil from this khaki kind of soil into much richer, darker soil. This example here is from the Ohio State University from long-term cover cropping trials. But I visited farmers in Equatorial Africa, in Central America, across the United States, on research farms and on full production farms, ranging up to 20,000 acre farms in the Dakotas. And what I found was that these farmers who had been very successful at restoring fertility to their land, at rebuilding healthy, fertile soils, all shared a set of practices, or shared practices based on the principles of conservation agriculture. And conservation agriculture has been defined by the UN as agriculture that follows these three principles of either minimal or no disturbance. So it would be no-till farming, or farming without tillage, without plowing. It would be farming that maintains a permanent ground cover that involves cover crops, so there's no bare earth left to the vicissitudes of wind or rain and erosional processes. And they planted diverse crop rotations. And the farms that had adopted practices that had all three of these principles, and these principles, by the way, are very similar to what Anne was doing in our yard. It's no coincidence. These are the practices that helped to rebuild in rapid order healthy, fertile soils. And what are all these little microbes doing around the screen here? I better not touch my mouse. What are all those little microbes doing on the screen? They are to remind me to say that this recipe, the minimal disturbance, a permanent ground cover or cover crops, and diversity to one's rotations, are a recipe for cultivating the beneficial life in the soil, those organisms that are involved in the biological bazaar. Why? Because, well, minimal disturbance or no-till, that's basically providing them shelter, a place to live. It's not breaking up their housing on a regular basis with tillage. Permanent ground cover and cover crops, that's a way to add organic matter to the soil, to provide food for them. And diversity of rotations, that's about providing a diversity of microbes to the soil which play different positions. Imagine how ineffective a baseball team that was all catchers would be. You need different positions. Having different positions gives versatility to a team. And the same is true for soil life in terms of promoting crop growth. But those general principles translate to different settings, but the specific practices don't. They need to be tailored to specific settings. The practices that farmers in Equatorial Africa that I visited used were very different from the actual practices that farmers in the Dakotas were using. They followed similar principles, but the specifics needed to be tailored to the climate, to the crops, to the landscape, to the economy that the farmers are working in, to the kinds of crops that they grow. But when the light went on for me, in terms of recognizing how these general principles translated across the board in different settings around the world, and what kind of results could be achieved. This shows you two soils from Ohio. The one on the left is from David Brandt's farm near Carroll, Ohio. The soil he started with back in 1971 is shown over here, with the soil from his a neighboring farm that he had actually just purchased because they went out of business, and Brandt was quite profitable. What was the secret to his success? Well, he conferred by adopting practices involved these no-till cover crops and a diversity of cover crops to get diversity into his farm, because he grows and sells wheat, corn, and soybeans for the commodity markets, but he gets diversity in with what he grows in between his cash crops. He converted this khaki soil to this rich, dark chocolate cake kind of soil. And it took him a while to do it, but he basically, his farm is very profitable relative to his conventional neighbors now. This next example that I'll show you is from Gabe Brown's farm in Bismarck, North Dakota. He's another regenerative farmer who's turned soil from the soil that his neighbor's farm has down here to the soil on the field that we sampled for this photograph there on the left. The color difference really speaks for itself, and that's all about carbon in the soil. It's about soil organic matter, food and fuel for the microbial world. That is the great underappreciated foundation for soil health and crop health, and as it turns out, human health. This shows you, this graph is borrowed from Gabe's TED Talk that basically looks at how his soil changed as he changed his farming practices. The bar over here on the left shows you what happened to the depth of the topsoil back in 1993. It was 3 inches deep. By 2013, it was 14 inches deep. He thickened the topsoil up. And when back in 1993, he started no-till farming, he had less than 2% organic matter. He diversified his cash crops. Then he integrated cover crops. Then he started growing a diversity of cover crops and extended his growing season to include cover crops. And by the time the early 2010s rolled around, and he started reintegrating livestock husbandry onto his fields, he was getting up to more than 6% organic matter. He more than tripled his soil organic matter, in other words, in less than 20 years. And to a geologist like myself, that's almost instantaneous. And I started to become an optimist when I realized that these practices were not just good for the land, but they're actually good for the farmers as well. The regenerative farmers I visited were more profitable than their conventional neighbors because they were spending less to grow just as much. And that makes for a better bottom line. And you don't have to take my word for it. Claire Lacan and Jonathan Lundgren put a paper out in the journal Peer J the year after Growing a Revolution came out that quantified some of the anecdotal evidence that I found from visiting farmers around the world. And what they found is this is a comparison of farms in the American Midwest, mostly growing corn, and these are all for corn fields, but it's comparing conventional farms on the left and the average of regenerative farms on the right. And what the bar graph shows is the total revenue in the top of the bars per hectare and the total cost that what the farmers spent to grow that crop in terms of the colored bits. What's left over is the profit. Now, what you'll notice is the regenerative farmers were harvesting more and getting paid more for it, spending less to do it, and therefore they had about 50% or so more profit than their conventional neighbors. That's what started turning me into an optimist that the style of farming, of regenerative farming, of farming adopting those principles of conservation agriculture, could actually take off, because it's not only better for the land in terms of restoring fertility to the land, it's better for the farmers who are operating their farms and even with the kinds of subsidies that we have today in agriculture, it was paying dividends to adopt these regenerative practices. And so what were some of the benefits of restoring healthy soil that I noticed? Higher farmer profits, that they were harvesting comparable yields by spending less money on fertilizer, pesticides, and fossil fuels as their soil health improved. Those are benefits that stayed on the farm, but there were also increased the amount of soil carbon, which can help, basically it's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and parking it in the soil where it does us good rather than harm, as in the excess in the atmosphere today. It also results in better water retention in their soil, which can translate into greater resilience to droughts. And by using less nitrogen fertilizer, it results in less offsite pollution. In other words, there's a lot of benefits to restoring healthy, fertile soil. But again, what started me down the road to optimism on this was it actually seems like it works out for the farmers as well as society. Now, there's one last dimension that I want to touch on in terms of the benefits of regenerative farming. And that's what Ann and I wrote about in our book that's forthcoming this spring. I think it's just been available for pre-order now for about maybe a week on the places that one does such things. But it's called What Your Food Ate, and it's a book that looks at whether these regenerative practices actually grow food that's better for us to eat, healthier, more nutritious food. And it's something that took us a couple extra years to look into than we had thought that it would, because it's a deep and thorny set of issues and questions, and connecting soil health all the way to human health has a lot of stops along the way in terms of crop health and livestock health. But one of the results that we noticed in reading back through the literature on what controls the nutritional quality of foods is that there's long been controversy on the question of nutritional differences between crops grown organically or using now conventional methods, but there's studies dating back to the 1940s that show farming methods can affect the nutrient density of crops, and that over-reliance on nitrogen-based fertilizers tends to compromise the nutritional quality of crops through lowering mineral micronutrients and affecting some certain vitamins. Oops. And what we basically concluded in What Your Food Ate was that a lot of that controversy relates not to simply the difference between organic and conventional practices, but to differences in soil health, and that it's the effects of farming practices on life in the soil that translates into differences in terms of the mineral micronutrient abundance, the vitamin content of crops, and also in terms of the phytochemical content. And we know phytochemicals as things like antioxidants and anti-inflammatories in our food. And we basically looked at examples in writing What Your Food Ate that look at the role of soil health in promoting the abundance of health beneficial compounds in our food. And I'll show you just a couple examples from some of the controlled tests that we did ourselves while writing What Your Food Ate. This first example shows you differences in the mineral content of wheat that was direct seeded or no-till planted with either 2 years of a diverse cover crops in between the cash crop of wheat, or with conventional glyphosate herbicide applications and fallow in between under conventional. And what we're showing here are the different elements ranging from boron up here at the top down to cadmium at the bottom. And the ratio on the right is the ratio between the amount of those elements in the cover crop wheat to the wheat that was farmed conventionally. And you'll notice, first of all, that all these green numbers are places where the cover cropped or the regeneratively grown wheat had more of those key elements. And these are things you actually want in your food, like zinc, copper. You don't want to eat a copper pipe, but copper is an important mineral micronutrient that helps support our immune system. And you want a decent supply of it in our food, not enough to be toxic, of course. But again, those things in green are things that are beneficial to human health in the right concentration. Notice that there's 56% more zinc in the regeneratively grown wheat in this particular example. You can't increase the zinc content of the soil by 56% in a couple of years. What you can increase is the ability of the microbial world, the fungi and bacteria in the soil, to harvest that zinc out of the mineral particles and get it into the actual crop. But notice the things shown in red here: sodium, nickel, and cadmium down there at the bottom. Those are all things that the conventionally grown crop had more of than the regeneratively grown crop. And you don't want sodium, nickel, and cadmium in your food. You want the other things in your food. And this was our first foray into looking at testing the mineral density, the nutrient density of the human food supply as a result of these regenerative farming practices. So the next step that we did is we found 10 paired sets of farms across the country where we compared that had the same soil type, where we had a regenerative and a neighboring conventional farm. So we found some of the regenerative farmers that I was visiting in writing Growing a Revolution, visited their farms, and also others that I've met along the way. And we measured the mineral density in crops and mineral, vitamin, and phytochemical density in the same crop variety grown in the same soil type on these neighboring conventional and regenerative farms. Each farmer grew sort of one example of either corn, soy, sorghum, peas, or cabbage for these comparisons. And what we found, we also tested the soil health, the differences in soils between these farms. And what we found is summarized on the soil end with these three colored box and whisker plots. So the way you read these is that on the left-hand one, we're looking at the percent soil organic matter for the regenerative farms in blue and the conventional farms in red. And this shows you the range of values. So that percent ranging from down here at 0 up to 12%. The regenerative farms had a lot more soil organic matter, more carbon. In terms of what's shown here is Haney, that's the Haney soil test. It's a measure of soil health. It measures not just the soil organic matter amount, but also the respiration and microbial activity in the soil. And the regenerative farms had much more active soil microbiota than on the conventional farms. How much more so? The graph on the right shows you the ratio, the distribution of the ratios. So in terms of percent soil organic matter, the regenerative farms on average had about twice as much. It ranged from about comparable to 3 times as much, on average about twice as much. In terms of soil health, it was almost 3 times the soil health score on the regenerative farms than on the conventional farms. In other words, there were big differences in the soils on the regenerative farms relative to the conventional farms. What did that mean for the food? Again, these are the same soil, same crop variety comparisons of regenerative farms to conventional ones. In terms of different minerals: calcium, copper, potassium, phosphorus, and zinc, basically with the different crops where we saw big differences, again, differences ranging from 10 to 10 to 20%, all the way up to twice as much in terms of copper and sorghum and the phosphorus in cabbage. But in other words, there are big differences in the mineral content for certain minerals, for certain crops on certain farm comparisons. We also found that in terms of vitamins, that the regenerative farms tended to have more vitamins, particularly vitamins K, C, E, and B1. Again, it was highly variable between farm pairings and between crops, but on average, there was more in the regenerative crops. And the thing that I think is probably most significant, but probably least recognized, is that systematically across these regenerative farms, the regeneratively grown crops had more phytochemicals, more carotenoids, phenolics, and phytosterols. These are the potent antioxidants and anti-inflammatories that were about a fifth more in the regenerative crops than in the conventional crops. We also looked at the fat content of livestock raised on one of these regenerative farms in comparison to store-bought conventional beef and pork. In terms of omega-3 fatty acids, which are a non-saturated fatty acid that is actually shown to have anti-inflammatory properties in the human diet, the regeneratively raised beef had about 3 times as much. The regenerative pork had about 4 or 5 times as much. If we look at the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is, you want a low omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, because omega-6 fatty acids, as a generality, tend to be pro-inflammatory, whereas omega-3s tend to be anti-inflammatory. The regeneratively grown beef had a ratio that is actually comparable to wild game. And the regeneratively grown beef was beef that was 100% grass-fed, and the pork was 100% grazed or fed the regeneratively grown crops from those farms. And again, the regenerative pork and beef had much lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. These are both trends that are interpreted in the public health literature to be beneficial to human health. And chicken and eggs showed comparable differences in terms of the regeneratively grown stuff, the light blue bars having more omega-3s than the conventional chicken or conventionally raised eggs. And that's a factor of 3, almost 4 difference in the omega-3 content in eggs or in beef and pork is actually a pretty big difference. So where we ended up with this most recent book in terms of what your food ate is concluding that, the way that we actually farm can make a difference to the nutritional quality of the human diet. And regenerative farming can double topsoil organic matter in a decade or two. In terms of what it can do to the total carbon sequestration in soils, that's still an open question. But in terms of topsoil building, regenerative farming seems to work pretty darn well over fairly rapid timeframes. But it can also result in foods that have increased phenolics, phytosterols, and carotenoids in crops, and more vitamins and mineral micronutrients, certain minerals and certain vitamins in different crops. But it can also increase the omega-3 content of meat and dairy, all things that are actually beneficial to the nutritional composition of the human diet. Although, of course, what that difference that could make to human health depends not only on how what we eat is raised, but on what we eat and what a balance and proportions of different kind of things we eat, and our genes and whether we exercise, all those kind of issues that also translate into human health. But where I think there's a connection that is starting to come into focus in the scientific literature that we've tried to review and in our own tests that we've done, that if you look back through the story that we've laid out, starting with dirt and now ending with what your food ate, you can make a solid case that poor soil health, degraded land, basically leads to challenged crop health and health challenges among farm animals. We go into that in great detail in what your food ate, and those connections lead to essentially undermining public health in our populations. But that in turning that around, healthy soils can support healthy crops and farm animals and can help provide a foundation for healthy people. Obviously, it's not the only thing that goes into setting our health, but the argument we make in What Your Food Ate is that healthy soils are a foundation for healthy crops, healthy livestock, and healthy people. Ideas that go back to the sort of the origins of the organic food movement. And we tell some of that history in What Your Food Ate as well. But the question is not as simple as organic versus conventional farming. Ann and I believe the real argument should be around the farming practices that build the health and fertility of the land, those are the practices that are actually help better for our health, for human health over the long run as well. So that's what I basically wanted to share in terms of, how I've spent my nights and weekends writing books over the last 10 years. Obviously encourage you to check them out, whether from the library or any other source, and share them with your friends. And I will stop sharing there. And I think if we have any questions, I'd be happy to engage in a few questions from folks. And if not, I'll run off and eat dinner.
No,